Hi, I'm Jared Draper with Tool Design Group, and I'm going to be giving you the overview for the FHWA's Bikeway Selection Guide. Thanks again for joining us for this module. We'll jump right in. So first of all, the Bikeway Selection Guide is, the purpose of this guide is really as a resource to help transportation practitioners consider and make informed trade-off decisions relating to the selection of bikeway types. We know that there are a number of different transportation practitioners, and this guide really helps to think through some of the decisions that are being made in the context that they're being made in. It's intended to supplement planning and engineering judgment. Really, the value of local judgment for both planners and engineers is extremely important. This guide recognizes that there is no one right answer everywhere. And so supplementing the judgment that's already being considered in your local context is extremely important. It incorporates and builds upon FHWA's support for design flexibility to assist transportation agencies in the development of connected, safe, and comfortable bicycle networks. And you'll hear if you join for other modules, and even today, those three words, connected, safe, and comfortable bicycle networks, are really important, that meet the needs of people of all ages and abilities. Really, the work that FHWA has been doing, as well as a number of other guidelines and documents around design flexibility to meet the needs of people that want a bicycle, no matter what their age or ability is something this guide recognizes and builds on in a great way. And FHWA has a lot of really important goals. First of all, the idea of increasing the number of short trips. Short trips are defined by FHWA and the strategic agenda for pedestrians and bicycle transportation as trips that are less than 5 miles for people on bicycles and less than 1 mile for people for pedestrians. And so increasing that number, the short trip numbers to 30% by 2025 is first and foremost one of the goals. And then also when it comes to safety, reducing the pedestrian and bicycle fatalities by 80% in 15 years, but ultimately to 0 in that 20 to 30 year period. We know that we've seen higher numbers of bicycle and pedestrian fatalities. In 2018, we had over 7,000 combined. And so this goal to reduce those pedestrian and bicycle fatalities is really important, not only to FHWA, but to transportation practitioners around the country. As something that you'll hear often in these modules, even though we are talking about design for bikeways and selection, this itself is not a design guide. The sole purpose is to be an assistant to, again, supplement some of that engineering and planning judgment, and to help practitioners make informed decisions by really getting on the same page in some of the conversation when we're talking about selecting bikeway types. There are a number of other guides that the Bikeway Selection Guide references, the MUTCD, AASHTO Green Book, as well as accessibility guidelines. FHWA has put out a number of different guides that will help, as well as NACTO and ITE. All of these guides can be used, and this the Bikeway Selection Guide points to these resources as a great starting point, because this itself is not a design guideline. Some of these other guides, FHWA, here are a few specifics: the Separated Bike Lane Guide, Achieving Multimodal Networks, Accessible Shared Streets, as well as Measuring Multimodal Network Connectivity are great resources. It should be noted that using multiple guides can strengthen the ability to justify some of our designs as well as our decisions when it comes to bikeway selection, whereas constantly just using one manual, one design guideline can seem to decision makers, our political leaders, and to the public as a broken record. And so using these resources together can really help when making some of the decisions. So as part of this introduction module, what we want to do is give you an overview of what all of the modules, if you were to be part of the workshops for the Bikeway selection guide, would include. And so without going into too much detail in any of them, but really focusing in on some of the highlights what the Bikeway selection guide workshop provides. And so first, we start about talking about how we got here, as one of the modules that follows this would include a pretty deep understanding of the history of Bikeway selection as well as bicycle facilities. You can see here the 1974 AASHTO guide for bicycle routes was one of the first in our country and really had some pretty ingenious ideas when it came to bikeway design and bikeway guidance. And so the module for around history and how we got here gives a review of the beginnings of bikeway design, what the impetus for the guidance was, as well as steps through history, and looks at some of the legacy decisions that we've made when it came to the 1980s, and then ultimately how those things impact us still today when it comes to bikeway selection as well as bikeway guidance. The history section, history module, really dives into the importance of how things changed, and then uses the AASHTO bike guide, bikeway design guide, as a reference as we step through history and looks at how things more contextually and what was happening in our environments that really changed decision making. And then a look to the future of upcoming guidance that could come out from AASHTO. The next piece is starting with the planning process and policy and planning. You can see this kind of flow chart steps through the individual chapters of the Bikeway selection guide. And so starting with planning is obviously extremely important. On many projects, especially new construction and reconstruction, the Bikeway selection process only needs to reference the figures that we discussed in the FHWA selection guide. And so the understanding that we need to move through that process systematically is important. And also, when we start to plan, we're planning for not only new construction, but also retrofits. And so some of these pieces, such as the policy that our communities already have, or the policy that we're developing, really impacts what's implemented and on the ground. We understand, and the FHWA planning Bikeway selection guide really notes that this is a multi-step process, and that if we don't plan appropriately, then ultimately our design may not be what we desire. And so having policy that provides the framework for Bikeway selection and decision-making is really valuable. The planning process means that we have to set up goals and translate those goals into concrete recommendations. We also need to understand that the selection process, both policy and planning frameworks, inform the specific choice of bikeways that are going to go into the ground. And then ultimately, when we do select that appropriate bikeway, that the planning and policy that's been done can be adapted to our local context to make sure that that bikeway, when it's implemented, meets the needs of our local users that have been identified in our plans. And so some of the planning inputs are these: network, users, bikeway types, and context. Those three words that I mentioned earlier, we believe that there are 7 principles that bicycle networks, the design of those networks, can be founded on. The first 3 you've already heard: safety, comfort, connectivity. However, there are other things that we should be considering: directness, cohesion, attractiveness, as well as unbroken flow. The workshop and the modules around this section of the Bikeway selection guide dive into these elements a little bit deeper, specifically understanding that safety, comfort, and connectivity really impact who our users are. And then the others, directness, cohesion, attractiveness, and unbroken flow, can really enhance the quality of our bikeway networks. The network context is really valuable, and we need to understand this up front so when we start to plan and we develop policy. Some of us in our communities have a lot of choice when it comes to where our bikeways can go. Maybe we have a lot of network that's available. So parallel routes or alternative routes are something that we can start to comb through in our decision-making process. But there are other communities that don't have those choices, or there's less options when it comes to their network. And so making these decisions and understanding the trade-offs of these decisions becomes more and more important. And so one thing that the Bikeway selection guide does is it starts the conversation early in that planning and policy phase, where we understand our network context locally. And so that when we are getting to the point of implementation, we have already created, or we've already understood what those trade-offs are, and ultimately how they're going to impact not only users, but also adjacent properties, as well as potential cost. Users is another key component when it comes to the planning inputs. You can see here, we kind of use 3 categories of bicyclists: the interested but concerned, the somewhat confident, and the highly confident. Historically, and again, something that we'll talk a little bit about in the history module, is that we have created bikeways that have been focused on or geared toward a more confident rider group. And ultimately, if we want to see some of those goals that FHWA has mentioned, increasing the number of short trips, decreasing fatalities, the type of design we need to focus on a design user that's capturing more people. 51 to 56% of our population kind of falls into that category of interested but concerned. And ultimately, those are the people that may have the opportunity for some of these short trips and to really increase our percentage for bicycling. So when it comes down to the networks that the bicycle selection guide looks at, there's an emphasis on low traffic stress, really comfortable facilities that people understand. I love these 2 contrasting images. One that has a bike lane, but ultimately a family has decided, because of the stress and because of the lack of comfort, that the sidewalk is a better choice. And so you can see that speed limit of 40 miles an hour is probably a huge reason for that choice, versus something that's a lot lower stress, shared use path that allows for people really of all ages and abilities to ride, to recreate, or even use as active transportation for some of those short trips. So a design user is really important as far as the planning inputs go. And then lastly, even though this is not a design guide, one of the things that we will touch on as part of the Bikeway selection guide training and one of the modules is an understanding of vocabulary. We want to make sure that everybody is on the same page. If we're going to discuss trade-offs, we also want to make sure that the terminology that's used is something that everybody is familiar with. And so we're going to be looking at kind of a variety of bikeway types that range from shared use paths and side paths through separated bike lanes, buffered bike lanes, paved shoulders, and then ultimately shared lane markings, which is not specifically a bikeway type, but obviously with some other specific physical features can be bicycle boulevards or neighborhood greenways. So this variety of bikeway types is going to be discussed in one of the modules. And what's really important about this is that you can see that separation from traffic is going to be one of the key factors when it comes to how comfortable someone feels within that bikeway type. And so what we design, what we select, is ultimately going to contribute to who is using those facilities, which is a really important thing for us to understand. The next piece of after planning is the actual tools themselves. And so you can see as we step through these pieces, the next overview after planning would be to identify the desired bikeway type. FHWA has broken this down into two kind of context-driven pieces. First is to understand how do we select a preferred bikeway type in the urban core, suburban, or in that rural town context. This comes down to two major factors, volume and speed. And as you dive into the module for selecting bikeway selection, you'll understand that really this is looking at kind of two different pieces. We have the urban core that's focused on some of the speed and the volume that's giving us different bikeway types. And then the rural roadways, it's a little bit different. We understand that these contexts may not have the same volume, may not have the same user types. And so the rural context is really more about what's the appropriate shoulder width for a user to feel comfortable. And oftentimes that shoulder width, because there's a low volume, can be both for bicycles and pedestrians. For the rural analysis, you'll learn a little bit more about the bicycle level of service. And then for that city, that kind of urban, small town and suburban roads, you'll learn a little bit more about the bicycle level of traffic stress. One thing to note is that these charts are a little bit blurry, and you'll learn in the module about facility selection, you'll really dive into why that is and why that's also important because of the local context in each place. The next module and kind of the overview of the bikeway selection guide is to assess and refine. So we work our way through these charts. Understanding what our desired bikeway type is great, but we really need to know, hey, what are the constraints along some of our corridors? And so our plans and our policies should have set up where these potential bikeways are, but then we need to look a little bit closer into the specifics of locations. And so understanding the assessing and refining nature of our communities, there are a lot of factors. This is just a few that FHWA dives into, and you and your own community may have even more to consider. But some of them include motor vehicle peak hour volumes, the vehicle mix, curbside activities, driveway and intersection frequency, the direction of operation, vulnerable populations or equity considerations, network connectivity gaps, and then transit considerations. All of these assessing and refining factors could lead to thinking about alternative or parallel routes, but ultimately we need to remember that not all of our community contexts are the same. And so the discussion after assessing and refining, while it may lead to looking at alternative routes, it may also lead to a deeper discussion on some of the trade-offs that could be included. Some of the photos, the training itself has a number of different photos so that as you're walking through some of the modules, you understand what some of these things can look like. So obviously deliveries, and then looking at some of our more vulnerable populations and looking maybe even specifically around schools in your community or other areas that really there are populations that need access to safe and comfortable bikeways. Typically, these populations are less confident in their bicycling abilities, or they may even be less visible to motorists. And in the case of children, they could actually lack some of the roadway experience or the physical maturity to understand some of the conflicts that may be present. And so if we understand that there may be more conflicts, we really need to assess what type of bikeway and maybe even refine specific locations along our bikeway corridors that could be most beneficial for those populations. Bringing back this graphic when it comes to assessing and refining, I mentioned it earlier, but the whole idea of choice, some of our networks lend themselves to a lot of choices. And so it's important for us as we think through not only the planning stage, but when we come back to assessing and refining, to understand that network context and then understand that there could be compromise that's necessary. And the trade-offs that we, along one segment, that could be acceptable in a small portion, but in other places may need a little bit more intense or a little bit higher quality of bikeway type, could cost more, or have another trade-off that our community may not be ready for, or there just needs to be more education around. And so that assessing and refining is really valuable as we move into as we work through bikeway selection. After we assess and refine, the next goal is feasibility. And this is kind of the on the ground work. We've planned, we've identified what we desire, we've thought about some of the bigger issues that are in our communities, and now we're getting ready to dive toward design. Now there's two pieces of this. New construction, and then there's reconstruction. And honestly, in every place that we've done this workshop, new construction seems to be the area that's can be a little bit less tricky. There are maybe some less constraints. Funding may be the biggest constraint when it comes to new construction. When we're retrofitting or reconstructing, this reallocation of roadway space is really important and can be something that we want to navigate thoughtfully. And so some of the options around reallocating space are narrowing travel lanes, removing travel lanes, one-way streets, changing street parking, reorganizing street space. And there are a lot of resources that are available. FHWA, you can see, has a road diet informational guide, as well as some other resources available online. When we get to the evaluating feasibility during the module, one of the things that we want to focus on is that if we have the obligation to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of the public, we really need to think through what that means on each individual case. One user's convenience or mobility should not be prioritized over another user's safety. And so one thing that this guide does is when we think about the retrofit, there's some great information in here, thinking about minimum widths of bikeways and not limiting or moving to a constrained scenario unless we've thought through some of the other options that are available. This quote from the guide is a really powerful, that we should be thoughtful and should be intentional around how we design and select our bikeways, and that evaluating feasibility is one of the key steps that we have before design, before implementation, to get this right and to think through how the bikeway that we've selected is the right choice for that specific location. And then finally, one of my favorite parts of the workshop that's available is the actual going through some of the examples. We work through throughout the day in each one of the modules, thinking about history and the planning, identifying some of the desired bikeway types, assessing and refining when it comes to our overall communities, talking through the evaluation of feasibility, which is a great way to think about how it's going to impact what's on the ground. And then ultimately in the module, we'll be looking at some of the illustrative examples of how selecting different bikeway types could look. And so some of two of the examples that we go through are a rural context as well as suburban, but there are a number of, the four listed here are examples that are in the bikeway selection guide. And I would encourage, if you haven't taken a look, it's a great opportunity to see how things change, as well as some of the trade-offs that could be involved. And one of the things that to note as I conclude is that one of my favorite parts about the bikeway selection guide and this overall training is the context sensitivity, understanding that each community is different. This is not the answer for every single community. It's not going to give an answer for your specific situation, but the conversation that it starts, some of the trade-offs that it identifies, the thought process and the flow to making the appropriate bikeway selection and putting that into practice are extremely valuable. And we hope that you'll be able to join us from some of the later modules.